What if I told you that within the next few minutes, you will be able to read any greenhouse gas inventory like a pro? And today I want to give you the keys. To make it concrete, we will be looking at together at the Apple's carbon footprint statement and review line by line. By the end of this video, you will be able to read any carbon footprint statement of any companies. And I also want to show you a twist that most companies are using in order to lower their carbon footprint total. All right, let's have a look. Every carbon footprint statement, or also called greenhouse gas inventory, are structured in three categories: Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. The Scope 1 is also called direct emissions. So that would be all the emissions emitted directly on the site of the company. So that could be anything related to the energy to power fleet of vehicles that belong to the company, or any emissions from building operations such as a heating system. The scope number 2, it's all about indirect emissions related to energy. So we are mostly talking about electricity. Why? Because emissions are emitted at the power plant and not at the company's site. But the scope 2 is also about the purchase of heat, steam, and cold to power the company's operations. So why would a company buy steam? No. It's not to power old trains, but it's usually to heat surfaces. So take New York City, for example. It is one of the largest steam networks in the world. The New York City steam network heats more than 1,500 buildings in Manhattan, which is the equivalent roughly of 5 times the surface of Central Park. So that's also why you can see a lot of chimneys on the street of New York City. If you have already worked in a company buying steam or buying heat or cold, let me know in the comment section. I am very curious to know what was the purpose for. And the last category is scope number 3, which represents all indirect emissions, and it's basically all the emissions from the value chain, whether it is upstream or downstream of your operations. That would be all the emissions from your suppliers, from transportation, from deliveries, from the usage of your product, from the recycling of your product. It's literally everything else. Most of the time, at least from my experience, it represents more than 80% of the total carbon footprint of a company. So it's a lot. So now let's take a look at a concrete example with Apple's carbon footprint report. And spoiler alert, you may be surprised with what I found. Let's have a look. All right, here is the environmental progress report of Apple for fiscal year 2023. So let's move to the page number 77. This is where you will find the greenhouse gas emission report. Let's zoom in a bit. First, we have the corporate emissions, where you will find scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. When we go down, we have the product life cycle emissions. Let's review line by line. Corporate emissions in scope 1, what do you find? Natural gas, diesel, propane. So these would be energies used to power the operations of Apple. So we can reasonably think that the natural gas would be used to heat the different offices of Apple. Fleet of vehicles, this is where we will find the energy used to power the vehicles that Apple operates. Other emissions, that would be all the emissions not from fossil fuels, but still are greenhouse gas emissions. So usually it's all about leaks from air conditioning or other gases usually used in laboratories or in research and development facilities. Scope 2, we have emissions from electricity consumption and the purchase of steam, heating, and cooling energies. In scope 3, we will find the traditional business travels, so flights, trains, and so on. Employee commute, so that will be all the movement between where people live up to the offices and the facilities of Apple. Upstream impact. This is an interesting one. So it says scope 1. If we go back to scope 1, we see we have some fossil fuel energies. But to produce these energies like a product, we need to emit emissions. Let's take, for example, natural gas. We need to extract natural gas, we need to refine it, we need to transport it up to the company where Apple buys the natural gas. And all of those emissions that are not directly related to the combustion of the gas would be in scope 3 under this category. Work from home, Well, this is a brand new category from COVID-19, but basically when we work from home, like I'm doing right now, well, the energy used to power the lights, to power the computer and so on, would be accounted in this category. Transmission and distribution losses. So this is a particular one related to Scope 2. When we purchase electricity to our energy supplier, there are losses between the power station and the site where we consume the electricity. So it can be as low as roughly 5 to 10% in developed countries, and it can be as high as around 25 to 30% in other regions. So what does it mean? Let's say, for example, you consume 1000 kilowatt hour at your place, all right? And you are living in Belgium or France, so we are, let's make it simple, with a loss rate of roughly 10%. It means that at a power station, the energy supplier had to produce 1100 kilowatt hour so that you get 1000 kilowatt hour at your home. And last, in Scope 3 of corporate emissions of Apple third-party cloud, of course, Apple is storing and using a lot of data in the cloud, so emissions from the suppliers of those services need to be accounted in this category. Okay, that's all for the corporate carbon footprint of Apple. Now, what about their product? Let's take a look. So what we can find here would be all the emissions related to the production of their product. You may know that Apple is not manufacturing all of their product portfolio. Maybe you've heard about some of their famous suppliers such as Foxconn. Well, in this case, the energy, the emissions that the suppliers are emitted to produce Apple's product need to be reported here. Those products, they need to be transported from the supplier to Apple and then to customers or shops. And all the emissions for those transportation would be accounted there. Product usage. Well, I'm using a computer right now and it requires electricity. So in this category, we will estimate what will be the entire energy consumption throughout the life cycle of the product. And usually this is a very important category when a company is producing and selling a device, a product that requires energy. The last line is end of life. So at some point, Apple's products, such as tablets, phones, computers, will not be good enough to be used. So they will have to be recycled or even put in landfills or burnt. So it depends a bit on the situation and the context that will define how a product will end its life. All right, now I would like to show you some numbers to put them into perspective so that you will understand the order of magnitude between Scope 1, 2, and 3. Let's take a look at Apple's example. So in this screen, you will find on the right-hand side the screenshot of Apple's carbon footprint assessment. And on the left-hand side, a surface graph where you will find the different emissions between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Now, this is interesting to realize that when you sum up Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, well, it's not 324,000 tons of CO2, but it's 471,000 tons of CO2. Someone at Apple was not careful enough when writing the report. And what is interesting is when we look at those numbers compared to the Scope 3 of the product emissions. And this is what I try to do to put those surface areas here at scale. Corporate emissions represent in total 3% of the carbon footprint of Apple, and the product life cycle emissions represent 97%, and it's entirely related to Scope 3. So what does this greenhouse gas inventory tell us? It tells us that most of the emissions of Apple come from their Scope 3 and more specifically from their product, and not from their offices or from their electricity consumption. Okay, now time to wrap up. But before I tell you how Apple discreetly reduced by 2/3 its corporate carbon footprint, please help me share the climate change insights with the community by hitting the subscribe button here. Okay, now congratulations. You know how to read a complex carbon footprint assessment like a professional. So now what's next for you? Which company would you like to assess the carbon footprint assessment? Or maybe you would like me to review another carbon footprint from another company. And if so, let me know in the comment section. Now, here is the secret twist that Apple used to reduce by more than 1 million tons of CO2 the carbon footprint of its corporate. Let's take one last look at their carbon footprint. Did you notice that in the electricity section, there is 0 tons of CO2 emission? Do you know how is this possible? It is thanks to a carbon accounting technique called market-based report. So better to warn you, some are calling it an innovative carbon reporting technique, but others find this to be quite controversial. So watch this video here if you want to know more about it and make your own opinion. See you there.